So, good afternoon, and welcome to this workshop. My name is Afe Adogame. I'm one of the organizers of this workshop. On behalf of my colleagues, David Daniels, who is here, and Yolanda Pierce, who is here in spirit, would like to welcome you to this workshop, African Christians and the Reformation. Just to say very quickly a few words of thanks. First and foremost, I would like to express our gratitude to the President, the Academic Dean, and the administration for supporting and funding this event as part of the wider events marking the 500 years Reformation anniversary. I would like to also express my gratitude to all the speakers for this two-day event who have left their very busy schedules and are here to share their research with us. So thank you to all of you who have made it here this day to be part of this conversation. Let me also say very quickly a word of thanks to Emmy, Ellen, Yvette, and the events department who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes handling logistics and other very important issues to make it really work out this way. Finally, I would like to express my thanks to colleagues, PTS colleagues, particularly from the History and Ecumenics Department who are represented here. Some are also joining us tomorrow. But also for the students who are here, I hope that this will be, at the end of this two-half-day event, you have a lot to take away and also to be part of this conversation. Okay, so that would be my way of starting, and I would like to invite my colleague David to come and say welcome as well.
I'd like to join Dr. Afe Adogame for expressing appreciation for you both being here and especially for our speakers who've come. Last year, there was a publication that I contributed to, and there was a question, the title was a question: will African Christians become a subject within Reformation studies? And this conference reflects that, and it's the opportunity to figure out how Africans can be part of that conversation. Especially when one looks at the long Reformation, going at least to 1700, our scholars, especially today, are already writing in that area. But one of the things, if you read their bio, none of our scholars are religious scholars. They are in Dutch studies and American studies broadly defined, or transatlantic studies, and in English literature. And so they're outside of the field of religious studies, but they're writing about African Protestants, and in some cases African Catholics, during this time period. And our goal, Professor Adogame, Professor Pierce, and our goal is to say, why can't they then be subjects? They're legitimate subjects in Elizabethan studies, Dutch studies, and transatlantic studies. Why can't they be legitimate studies in Reformation studies? So you're on the cutting edge. During this 500-year celebration, this is one of the few places in the world, literally, that is discussing Africans in relationship to the Reformation in the 16th and 17th century. So do feel yourself as history makers. And then my last comment, there's a whirlwind in some theological circles on Facebook and on Twitter. A week and a half ago, I published an op-ed that I didn't title, but the newspaper titled it, "Honor the Reformation's African Roots." And then it got picked up by Religious News Service, and they also gave a title that I would not have used, and it's called Martin Luther's Dream Church. Dream was in quotation marks, and it's not in Europe. So you're in this place, and so people are trying to grapple with what does that mean, and I'll unpack some of that tomorrow. But again, this is an opportunity that is possibly either a dead end, that people say there's nothing to talk about, or it's the beginning of a new day. And our Reformation scholars will begin to read the works of people that you'll hear today. So welcome, and again, we're excited for a great conversation. Oh, I should say, thanks to Dr. Adogame, because he did all the heavy lifting. He and Dr. Pierce are supposed to do it. The SHE course is in D.C., so thank you, sir.
Yes, I must say that this conversation started sometime last year. We were at a conference in Germany that was convened by my colleague there, Frida Ludwig. And following that conference, we thought perhaps we should have, take this kind of conversation forward. And so I would really say the push was from David. I only had to obey his orders. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. You have the program before you, and we will try to follow that meticulously. And we have the speakers presenting each for about 45 minutes, and that will leave us in each case with 30 minutes Q&A and discussion. I know that the two speakers today will be leaving us to attend to pressing official assignments, but let me just express my gratitude for your time, to be here. Okay? All right, so by way of introduction, what I wanted to do was perhaps, because a lot of the papers at this workshop would be focusing mainly on 15th, 16th, 17th century, I thought I should, fast forward before we rewind. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to do, looking back to the future. To what extent do I understand the whole Reformation enterprise, particularly from the point of view of African Christianity? And so I thought it was important to start this way. The Protestant world is currently preoccupied with commemorations of the 500th anniversary year of the Reformation, although with more celebrations in Germany, parts of Europe, and the global north than in the global south. This year, 2017, marks a significant watershed for world Christianity, symbolizing the historical trajectory from Martin Luther's Ecclesia Revolution in 1517. Although what constitutes the Reformations transcends this experience with hindsight of encounters within the Catholic tradition, this singular momentous event resulted in a huge coterie of church denominations and affiliations now existing within the fluid umbrella of Protestantism. This historic moment affords also an opportunity for reflexive nostalgia with regards to the impact of the Protestant Reformation in translating and transforming Christianity across the globe. It also allows us to cast a critical glance at the secularization process as a backlash and most probably an unintended consequence of the Reformation. Attendant to this is perhaps another unintended impact, that is, the shift in the center of gravity of Christianity from the global north to the global south. And we continue to witness significant global changes in Protestant Christianity since 1517. There are now 560 million Protestants found in nearly all the world's 234 countries, as suggested by the Center for the Study of Global Christianity Research, with the two largest Protestant demographics in Africa and Asia, respectively. The survey report also claims that, and I quote, despite Europe being the birthplace of Protestantism, it is expected that by 2050, less than 10% of Protestants will live in Europe. Today, Africa is home to 41% of all Protestants. By 2050, it's expected that 53% of all Protestants will live in Africa. So, this center has provided quite a lot of statistics, looking at Protestants by continent, and the statistics is obvious. At the same time, they have provided, statistics about countries with the largest populations of Protestants. Of course, I mean, these figures can be very well contested. I, for one, don't believe strongly in these statistics, but they do tell us something about some of these developments that we are witnessing. So the survey also shows us Protestants in the context of Christian traditions, trying to see Roman Catholics, Protestants, Independents, and Orthodox. Of course, these terminologies are fluid in themselves. And this is partly demonstrated sometimes, as we shall see in the next slide. But here, again, they give us figures of the largest Protestant denominations in a country. And these figures, I think, speak volumes, even though we can query the authenticity or the modes of this kind of statistics. But what is also important is the fluidity, what is considered to be Protestant today. And we can see to what extent the fluid boundaries between Protestants and evangelical and Pentecostal charismatics. So it's no longer a straightforward answer. And I like this slide very much because it always also first shows how ignorant the BBC can be, But at the same time, it says something about the Anglican Church worldwide. And you can see the statistics, even though here is shown that West Africa is a country, and Nigeria is not part of West Africa, yes. But I think what might simply be useful is just looking at the statistics. I think it shows you that in terms of demographics, something is really happening. Having said that, we might ask the question, what triggers this rapid demographic shift? And I think much research is showing that this has not happened largely through the work of missionaries, but much more so through the work of local agency. And I think this is very important in trying to understand today the place and texture of African Christianity. But we can also ask how we can possibly capture this vast richness, perhaps also contradictions that are evident in African Christianity in light of globalization. But that is a topic for another day. So what I will try to do very quickly is to highlight some imprints of the Reformations, and then perhaps towards the end of my introduction, focus on the African instituted churches or the African indigenous churches and the whole debate about Reformation, just to end. Perhaps it's pertinent to ask questions like this. Did the European Reformation and its various Protestant streams have a direct or indirect impact on this religious mobility and revival in Africa? Perhaps put differently, how did Africans conceive of, understand, and speak about the European Protestant Reformation historically, but also in contemporary time? What is happening as we have at this time all kinds of celebrations across Europe and North America? What exactly is happening in Africa? I think is an important question. How relevant is the Reformation in coping with their everyday lives and experiences? And perhaps a very pertinent question would be, what lessons and promise does the anniversary have for African Christianities in their quest for social and political responsibility within the abstraction, one world? And I think perhaps these questions we will come back to some of these questions shortly. Now, so let me try and quickly say a few things about the AICs, the African Indigenous Churches, or instituted or initiated or international or independent. I think these various acronyms represent one of the most profound developments in the transmission and transformation of both African Christianity and Christianity in Africa. And to a large extent, the African instituted churches constitute a significant filament of African Christian demography. And I single them out because it was with their proliferation that actually led scholars to compare what was happening in Africa with the European Reformation. So that is why I like to simply zero in on this. And so what is significant is the question, the point made by John Mbiti in 2008 in describing AICs as an African opportunity to mess up Christianity in their own way, you know. So what does this mean? And I won't go into who makes up the AICs, but you can find this phenomenon in different regions of Africa: West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, but perhaps not in North Africa, although there's sense in which aspects of Coptic Christianity are linked to indigeneity and so on and so forth. Okay, so now what is interesting for me is how AICs, or this group of churches, were seen as a fundamental reformation of African Christianity. And here I just want to isolate a few scholars who started the debate. And the first was James Webster, who spoke of the rise of African churches in the period 1888 to 1922 and described it as an African Reformation. Following Webster was David Barrett's groundbreaking book, Schism and Renewal in Africa, that attempted to make a cogent case for seeing independency as a manifestation of a vast movement of reform of the Christian community that is not restricted to AICs alone. So this is the point. Of course, here I'm focusing on the AICs, but David Barrett is not limiting this to the AICs. There are, again, Pentecostal charismatic movements that come into this picture. These were not the only two scholars who tried to liken this phenomenon, this development to Reformation. There were other scholars who followed in this regard. However, I consider some of the reflections by Barrett very interesting. For instance, David Barrett said, and I quote, "There is a striking number of parallels between the story of African independency as it has unfolded thus far," and this is writing in the 60s, "and the European Reformation of the 16th century." If you want to read a bit more about his argument, chapter 13 with the subtitle Renewal and Reformation in Africa, I find it very illuminating. So here he attempted to describe the AIC movement as one with, quote and unquote, a radical mission of renewal and reformation. And according to Barrett, AICs constantly refer to themselves as a reformation of over-Europeanized Christianity, unquote. And again, quote, are conscious of a kind of a reforming mission. And I think this already points out the kind of comparison he was trying to put forward. Just one or two more points from Barrett. He argued and described the entire AIC movement, quote again, has discovered and implemented some of the major theological concerns being expressed elsewhere in the world concerning a reformation of the Christian community, unquote. And I think he was making a very salient point here in trying to kind of contrast, what happened in the 16th century and what he was now observing in the 20th century, and perhaps asking, can we draw parallels of any sort? to what extent can we see commonalities, but also to what extent is the European Reformation drastically different from what is being observed within the continent and beyond. And so finally, Barrett says that this Reformation had occurred in the context of Africa itself, spurred on by the vernacular translation of the Bible, as was also the case with, quote, numerous earlier reformations and theological renewals in history. Of course, I mean, this is very well contested. I remember in Germany last year at Frida's conference, I had a provocative title, From European to African Reformation. And some of my German colleagues said, no, there's no way you can compare. They are two different things. And I said, okay, what is Reformation? Maybe we unpack this. It talks about reform. It talks about mobility. It talks about transformation. So is this not a way we can also express what is going on? You know, and they were not convinced. But anyway, I kept my argument. Okay, so let's leave Barrett and take one more scholar. Hans-Jürgen Becken, also in his research on the AIC movement in South Africa, talked about African Reformation of Christianity, which he described as similar to the Protestant Reformation in Northern Europe. And so the question that emerges is, what does it mean, you know, when scholars, you know, try to compare the 16th century phenomenon and event with what you find, you know, currently? And much more recently, Alan Anderson actually came up with a book with the title African Reformation. Again, on the one hand, he was not focusing simply on AICs, but in another level, he had a theological definition of AICs that, you know, spanned beyond AICs themselves to include Pentecostal charismatic churches. And the central thesis of this book is that we can talk about reformation of the spirit that has revolutionized the face of Christianity. And I think if we read his argument, he has many things to say in this regard. In a way, the book provides an extensive overview of AICs and Pentecostal charismatic churches in different parts of Africa. And of course, following his book, Joel Tishkin wrote a brief history and typology of the African Reformation. So why am I bringing all this? I'm just trying to show that the whole attempt to compare what was happening in Africa and what happened in Europe in the 16th century started, you know, in the 60s when scholars started to ask these questions. But I think those questions are still very relevant for us now as we mark the 500 years anniversary. Because of my time, let me come to the last part of my presentation. So, is there a sense in which we can look at Reformation as a continuum, as an ongoing process rather than as a one-off event? So in other words, what enables us to look at the 16th century event and see what we are experiencing today as an impact, as a consequence, you know, of what happened then? In other words, to what extent did this singular event shape the texture of Christianity globally? And I think this is an important point. And therefore, perhaps we might argue that African Reformation in this regard may serve as a kind of a continuity, but also a rupture of European Protestant Reformation. And perhaps this may help us to explore not just the affinities, not just the commonalities, but also peculiarities and ambiguities that are inherent in each process. And what this might suggest partly is that binaries of Catholic Protestant dichotomies are too fluid, you know, they are too simplistic and vague to map the complexity of African Christianities. It is much more, taking the AICs, for instance, that are in their, thousands, where do we fit this category of churches? So Pentecostal and charismatic churches, just as the AICs, are sometimes perceived as actors in the mobility of Protestant Christianity in contemporary Africa. But I think it leaves us with a question, are these Protestants as well? What are they protesting against? I think these are larger questions we can perhaps. So what I've done, just by way of concluding, is to perhaps think of ways in which one might attempt to contrast African Christianities as African Reformation with European Protestant Reformation. And here I just itemize a number of threads. For instance, looking at periodization, looking at the spiritual renewal process that is still unfolding, or perhaps looking at it from a political angle, the challenge of orthodoxy, hegemony, and all ideas around paternalism, that we can look at both contexts. Then, of course, cultural imprints and spontaneity, question of agency, catalysts for change. I mean, I could expand on each of these issues, but we don't have time for that. But also the attitude to gender parity, culture, theology, reaction to other faiths, and so on and so forth. But the very contestation of Christian identity itself becomes an important point to think through. And finally, we can also think about the global reach and impact that we might maybe talk about. First, looking at the European Reformation, but also looking at what some scholars now take as African Reformation. Okay, so to contrast, therefore, I'm asking the question, how has Africa as a continent, Africans as individuals, African churches as institutions responded to the European, but also the African Reformation? And I tend to look at this ambivalently, looking at their reactions, but also their responses. And perhaps one way that might be instructive to do this, I thought about looking at it from the institutional angle, looking at it from the level of the public, but also the level of the individual. And I think we could explore, for instance, at the level of the state, colonial and post-colonial dynamics. We could compare the whole dynamics of mainstream versus non-mainstream Christianity. We could look at local, global, ecumenical networks. But at the same time, we could even look at the whole demonization process, which you find, in both cases. So I have been thinking in my head, perhaps, of this way to try to make sense of this attempt to contrast, these different, processes. And I find it quite useful so far in trying to do that. But the last thing I would say, just to end, is that how are African churches or individuals or institutions actually trying to mark the 500-year anniversary? Are they doing, who is doing what? And if you look at across Africa, yes, definitely. There are many ways in which African churches and congregations and individuals are marking this. But is it the same way? Do they have the same memory? Do they have the same history, with what we are witnessing in Europe and North America? So I just wanted to end, for instance, with a Pentecostal church having a one-day workshop to celebrate the 500-year anniversary. And this is what they call a one-day national conference on the 500-year anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses and the Reformation. A way of kind of thinking about the impact. What has a Pentecostal church got to do with this? So this is the question I'm asking. If an event that was organized by a Pentecostal church Bible college, to try to make sense of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses and the impact, then I think we have something interesting to have a conversation about this afternoon and tomorrow. So thank you for your attention.